Welcome to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp, President of Sharp Research and Translation. Our show today, Taiwanese-American Relations, a perspective from inside the Beltway. And joining us from Washington, D.C. via Skype is Dr. Gerrit van der Weiss. Gerrit is the Senior Policy Advisor and also of FAPPA, the Formosan Association for Public Affairs, where he also is editor of the newsletter Taiwan Communique. Welcome to ThinkTech Asia, Gerrit.
Thank you very much, Bill. Really pleased to be able to join you from this distance. I wish you could be sending me some of the warm air. It's pretty cold here.
Well, we'll send you some of the warm air as long as you don't send us any of that cold air, and especially keep the snow there.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
Well, you know, a lot of folks probably are not familiar with FAPPA. Could you explain a little bit about the organization to us, its origins, its goals, etc.?
Yes, indeed. It's a Taiwanese-American grassroots organization. We were established in 1982, and it's basically an organization of people who immigrated from Taiwan to the United States in the 60s and 70s. They studied here in the States, and they became quite interested in things like democracy. But at that time, Taiwan was still very repressive under the Kuomintang regime. So they wanted to do something to help Taiwan make a transition to democracy. And therefore, they set up FAPPA in 1982 to work mainly with Congress and with the U.S. State Department on issues like the martial law in Taiwan, democracy in Taiwan, in order to help Taiwan make this transition to democracy, which eventually happened.
So yeah, actually, most of these, it sounds like the folks that are members of FAPPA are actually a very highly educated group. They probably all have graduate degrees, or at least a very high percentage of them do.
Yes, indeed, yeah. Many of the people that are members of FAPPA did receive their graduate studies in the United States. Many of them are professionals, doctors, lawyers, and also people in the various engineering fields. And actually, we do have a chapter in Hawaii, but also 53 other chapters in different parts of the United States with heavy concentrations in California and New York, of course, but then in the university towns in between, like Manhattan, Kansas, we have quite a strong chapter. And that is
right in the middle of the country.
Yes, indeed. That's because the university there.
Well, okay, now, initially, those folks that were in the U.S. studying for advanced degrees at the time the organization started in 1982, okay, I would suspect that many of them are still very active in the organization, but how about, you know, folks that came from Taiwan to study in the U.S. at a later date? Have they been joining the organization as well?
At a later date, if you're talking about the 90s and the 2000s, there was perhaps less of a need because Taiwan was already a democracy. And therefore, they basically didn't need to, quote unquote, fight for democracy. But the organization does have a very strong second generation group. The sons and daughters of the first generation are now coming online, as we say, and becoming quite active in the organization here in the States, but also back in Taiwan. If I may jump to the sunflower movement of last year, quite a number of the people who worked with the sunflower movement were second generation Taiwanese Americans also.
I see. Well, so basically your organization is set up to do, at this point at least anyway, is to do, shall we call it lobbying, to still represent the interests of this core group of FAPPA supporters, the folks that got FAPPA up and moving?
We call it an advocacy organization.
Okay.
Basically, our focus originally was, of course, human rights and democracy. And when Taiwan had made its transition to democracy in the late 1980s, early 1990s, then that became less of a need. And then we switched our focus to Taiwan's membership in international organizations. So we got members of Congress, both House and Senate, almost every year to introduce resolutions for Taiwan in the United Nations, for Taiwan in the World Health Organization, and other organizations. So that was our main focus in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And then when President Ma Ying-jeou came to power in Taiwan in 2008, then we switched focus slightly again. We maintained the focus on international organizations and support for arms sales in Taiwan, but also tried to alert the members of Congress and the State Department about what we call erosion of democracy in Taiwan, erosion of the judicial system, and the gradual trend under President Ma Ying-jeou in China's direction, which went, in the view of many of our members, too fast and too far.
Wow, that's interesting. So you are a registered lobbying group in Washington, I take it.
FAPPA itself spends less than 20% of its time on lobbying. So we are formally classified as a 10C3 organization, so a non-profit organization that does engage in lobbying for less than 20% of its time.
So you don't need to register for that, in other words?
Not as a lobbying organization.
Oh,
we are
I see. That's
C3
interesting. Well, but you work very closely with the Taiwan lobby, though, if I understood you correctly.
Well, we talk to people in Congress and we talk to people in the State Department on issues that are related to the Taiwanese-American community and their concerns. And in many cases, those overlap with the concerns that the people in the community have for Taiwan.
I suspect that your skills gathered as a diplomat are very useful in that regard.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I think we basically are able to reach out to people in Congress, people in the State Department, and in the so-called think tanks here in Washington to try to present the case from the Taiwan perspective. I think for too long, the Taiwan storyline here in Washington has been dominated too much, certainly in the old days, by the old Kuomintang, which said we are the government of all of China, which was certainly not tenable anymore at that point in time. But also the fact that they were not really representing Taiwan at that point in time. So I think those 2 points are ones that we educate our contacts on.
That's so true, and especially nowadays, it's unfortunate that China often overclouds any kind of exposure that Taiwan otherwise might get, it seems.
Yeah, that is indeed the point, that always the Taiwan story has been seen as a subset of the China story. And what we try to tell our contacts is, hey, look at Taiwan in its own right. It has its own history. It has its own population with these desires and wishes to be a member in the international community. And try to take a look at that instead of always saying, hey, what will China think of this? So presenting Taiwan in its own light, in its own right, that's what we are trying to do.
I think that's an important mission. It's certainly something that clearly needs to be done. Well, how does your organization finance itself? Is it strictly through membership dues?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, we are a membership organization. As I mentioned, we have 54 chapters across the United States, and our members basically pay their annual dues, and that finances our operations here in Washington. It's really a small shoestring organization. We just have 4 members in our headquarters here in Washington. But the strength of the organization is the fact that we do have these local chapters. And when we, like, for instance, a congressman or senator from California to do something, introduce something, we contact our members in California. They, in turn, talk to their congressman or senator. Mm-hmm. And then, then it becomes suddenly a issue of the constituent of that congressman or senator. And that really helps us then follow up here in Washington on those particular issues.
Well, how much do the dues run per annum?
Sorry?
Well, what's the range of the dues? I suspect there's like there's different tiers of membership.
Yeah. Well, there is $50 for individuals, $70 for couples, and then we have a number of honorary memberships, so to say, for people who donate more per year.
Well, so it's very reasonable.
Yeah.
Now, okay, you're the chief or senior policy advisor, as well as the editor of Taiwan Communique. In your role as senior policy advisor, what do you do?
The 3 main areas that we focus on are, one, working with think tanks here in Washington. There are quite a number of think tanks, the Brookings Institution, the Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, and they all have people who are quite knowledgeable about East Asia, and on occasion they have presentations, so we go there and we present our point of view at those events. So, and that trickles into the policy-making community here in Washington. And I think that is quite important for people to understand that there is an alternative view from Taiwan on many of these issues.
Oh, that's a great point. That's a great point. How many subscribers do you have to the Taiwan Communique?
We have about 2,500 subscribers across the world, about 1,800 in the United States, 200 in Taiwan, and then about 500-600 in Europe mainly. And also, of course, electronic subscriptions, so we send it to some 2,000 people electronically also.
Oh, so it's about 2,500 folks or institutions receive it electronically, and then about another 2,500 by mail?
It overlaps to some extent, as some people have both the electronic version and both of them.
Isn't there a FAPPA in Japan as well, or a FAPPA-like organization?
No, not really. There are like-minded people in Japan and in Europe, of course, but FAPPA as an organization is only based in the United States, and we have one chapter in Vancouver in Canada. So we also have a group of people that are active in Canadian politics.
Well, now, what's the editorial policy of the Taiwan Communique?
Our main purpose, very much in the beginning, was to present information about developments in Taiwan that was not available to the international community. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, most of the Western media basically only published information fed to them by the Kuomintang authorities. And we presented this alternative view, and we basically published every 2 months to give a little bit of an account, a chronological account of developments and events in Taiwan. So we started that actually before FAPPA started already in 1980. And we have been doing that until now, so about 35 years now. So that is, it's quite a history. So if any of your listeners want to know anything about what happened in Taiwan in, for instance, 87 or 88, go to our website and look at our issues in those years.
Okay, well, Gerrit, I think we'll take a break here and we'll come right back. You're watching ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. My guest today is Dr. Gerrit van der Weiss, who's joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C., and we'll be right back.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroots Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week, we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Gerrit van der Weiss, joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. And we've been talking about Taiwan-American relations, a view from inside the Beltway. Welcome back. Where were we? We were talking about the editorial policy of the Taiwan communique. I think we have pretty well wrapped that up, but is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, basically, we give people an insight in current affairs in Taiwan and also an overview. Not too many people have the time and energy to read publications from Taiwan every day. So what we try to do is present summaries of developments and main events over the past 2 months. So we publish about 5-6 times a year.
I have to say the Taiwan communique is very informative, and I've learned a lot of things from it. The book reviews are especially good, I think. I really appreciate the opportunity to read those with every publication. You know, sometimes it seems that folks confuse FAPPA with the Democratic Progressive Party. And would you like to respond to that? Because oftentimes people, in my experience, seem to equate the two.
Well, we are an American organization, as I emphasized, with Taiwanese-American members across the United States. Well, the DPP is obviously a Taiwanese organization based in Taiwan and participating in political life in Taiwan. So on a number of issues, I think our interest and positions do run parallel, but we are certainly very different organizations because they are a Taiwanese organization and we are an American organization.
Does FAPPA advocate Taiwan independence? Is that a sort of a basic policy or goal of FAPPA?
From the very beginning, we have always emphasized that it is up to the people in Taiwan to determine their own future, and that future needs to be determined in a free and democratic fashion without outside interference. And then, of course, you do mean interference from across the United States. And if the people in Taiwan would want to vote for independence at some point in time, we would fully support that.
Well, basically then, from what you just told me, FAPPA's stance is very similar to the stance of the U.S. government. The U.S. government are saying that, you know, they seek to create an environment in which people in Taiwan can determine their own destiny.
Yeah, indeed, yeah. The U.S. has always emphasized that the future of Taiwan needs to be determined peacefully. That is based in the Taiwan Relations Act, And also subsequent governments have always emphasized that it needs to be determined with the assent or consent, as some other people phrase it, of the people in Taiwan, so in a democratic fashion. So that is indeed the basic policy of the United States. But at the same time, the U.S. has always mentioned the so-called One China policy, and that has led to a lot of misunderstandings because too many people interpret the One China policy as being One China and Taiwan is part of China. And that second sentence is certainly not the case. I think that really needs to be emphasized. The U.S. has only acknowledged the Chinese position, but always maintained that the future of Taiwan still is open and needs to be determined, again, peacefully and with the assent of the people in Taiwan.
I think it's true. Taiwan society is so distinctly different than mainland China society. I often wonder, how the two could ever possibly go together.
I think one very important thing is also that democratization in the late 80s, early 90s has brought about a revival of interest in Taiwan's own history and in Taiwan's own identity. If you look at opinion polls from 92 on, then you see a tremendous increase of the number of people who say we are Taiwanese as opposed to we are Chinese, or we are both Chinese and Taiwanese. In 1992, the percentage of people said we are Taiwanese was only about 20%. Now it's more than 70%. Well, people saying we are Chinese only has been reduced to less than 5%.
It seems to me that the Sunflower Movement really accelerated that phenomena, and it increased the Taiwanese sense of self-identity. And it really the result was it really built that sense of identity even more firmly than perhaps it has become in recent years.
Yeah, indeed. What the Sunflower Movement did was really change the basic thinking about how politics is being done in Taiwan. Until that time, it was still run pretty much along the vestiges of the old system that existed even under the martial law years. Although, of course, you had elections for the legislative yuan and for the presidency, but some of the old interests were still very strong. I think what the Sunflower Movement did was really change the political landscape in Taiwan to a landscape where the playing field is much more level than it was ever before. Before, you had vested interest with a lot of money that were able to buy their votes into position. And I think the Sunflower Movement has not totally ended that, but has certainly meant the beginning of the end of such a system. So now you have a much more level playing field between the parties in Taiwan than ever before. And we saw that in the elections at the end of November, and suddenly the DPP received a very significant boost, and you really had a political landslide in the direction of the DPP.
Let's come back to the election in just a minute, but I'm sitting here, I'm so interested in this, and I don't think I've ever asked you, but why not now, is you have such an interesting background. You studied aeronautical engineering, as I understand it, to get a bachelor's degree and master's degree, and then took a completely different course. You got a PhD in economic development. And how did you end up as one, so interested in Taiwan affairs, one who knows, it seems, everybody in Washington who's somehow connected to Taiwan affairs and has an insight on all of them? How did you get into this, this pursuit of Taiwan affairs? And then we'll talk about the election.
That happened in the 1970s when I was studying at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I got to know a number of students from Taiwan who basically indicated that all was not well in Taiwan at that point in time, and who wanted me to help in various ways. And one of those was my future wife. So when we got married in 75 in Seattle, that basically sealed my fate for Taiwan, and I've been active in Taiwan affairs ever since then.
Oh, interesting, interesting. I have to say, in my own personal situation, my interest in Taiwan evolved in a similar fashion. I attended the University of California, Berkeley as an undergraduate, and I had a large contingent of students from Taiwan. I got to know many of them, and it just sparked my interest. Well, let's go on to this election now, the 9-1 election. And it was really a rout for the ruling party, the Nationalist Party. And some people expected that they might lose, but they didn't expect the degree to which they lost. What do you see as being the cause of this rout of the KMT?
I think the main issue was a general discontent with the governance of the Kuomintang government, the way it dealt with issues, the way it dealt with problems, going way back to the Typhoon Morakot in 2009, which really caused quite an uproar because the government hardly did anything the whole first week after it happened. And that continued and continued over time in many different areas and issues. Nuclear power was one issue where people felt pretty broad discontent. And that eventually culminated in opposition against the so-called surface trade agreement that the Ma government had signed with China. And this surface trade agreement had not been published at all, had not been discussed at all. Then it was sent to the legislative yuan for approval without hardly any discussion. And that really prompted originally the Sunflower Movement, and that discontent continued between March, April, and November. And the DPP and its candidates were able to capitalize on that. So general discontent with the policies and with the lack of transparency of the government. And then a third issue which we should also discuss is the underlying issue of the China factor, how that affected the elections. I think that's also an important point.
Wow, this really, it's such an interesting phenomenon, this election, the 9-1. For the benefit of our viewers, the 9-1 election sought to determine the occupants of 11,130 political positions at the local level in Taiwan, everything from the mayor of the major cities to a village or borough chief. We're going to take another break here. I'm Bill Sharp, your host on ThinkTech Asia. My guest today is Dr. Gerrit Weiss, who's joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. Our topic today has been Taiwanese-American relations, a view from inside the Beltway, and we'll be right back.
Aloha, Yappers. This is your host, Kingsley, for the Yap Show. Every Friday, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. You can catch us here live. ThinkTech Hawaii, and then later on we upload to our YouTube channel. We talk about youth issues, policies, youth programs, and how to transition yourself into adulthood.
But this was like a sign, I guess. Hey, life's like, hey, right. Now's your chance to go back to school, which I'm doing.
Catch us here again live, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Asia. I'm your host, Bill Sharp. Our guest today is Dr. Gerrit Weiss, who's joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C. We've been talking about Taiwanese-American relations and getting his perspective on the relationship, a view from inside the Beltway. We were talking about the 9/1 election. I think there's a couple things else we might want to talk about there. One was, and I'm interested in your perspective on this, was Mr. Ke, who ran as an independent and got elected as the mayor of Taipei, which is, in most people's view, the second most important political position in Taiwan, the first, of course, being the president. What's your take on his election?
He really ran a very unconventional campaign. Traditionally in Taiwan, as I mentioned earlier, the campaigns are based on how much money a candidate has, and they put out advertisements on TV, big billboards in the city, and dozens of trucks in the city with blaring speakers. He did a totally different campaign. He didn't do any of that. He set up a Facebook page and a web page, and through that he activated his people. He got them to come to various events. So it was really a major achievement to have a campaign run and won through Facebook. So Mr. Mark Zuckerberg in California can be pretty proud of that, actually. But what happened on the other side of the political spectrum, the opponent against whom he ran was Mr. Sean Lien, and he is a very son of a very rich Kuomintang former leader, Lien Zhan, who ran both in 2000 and 2004 as president. And Mr. Sean Lien, the son, basically was perceived by many people as not really bringing in any new ideas, but was only able to run on the wealth of his father. And that was rejected. What was also rejected was his attempt to really throw a lot of mud at Mr. Ke, and that didn't stick, and that backfired. Mr. Ke ran a very optimistic and positive campaign, and his major theme was, we should hug Taipei, and that really reverberated amongst the people in Taipei and brought him a major landslide.
I wonder sometimes if this is a beginning of a new political era in Taiwan, an attempt to sort of bridge the gap between the green and the blue. I call it, I like this term, which I was thinking about a couple of weeks ago, the beginning of the era of turquoise politics in Taiwan. I don't know, that's probably just a little bit premature, but it does seem that the people in Taiwan are in many ways fairly tired of both the Nationalist Party and the DPP. They're tired of the gridlock. They're looking for a third way. And you know, I sometimes wonder if Mr. Ke might be the one to lead that way. Yet, you know, it seems to me he is getting off to a bit of a rough start as mayor of Taipei. I mean, he's a very, very accomplished physician. But this political game this is a new experience for him, as he himself admits. And some of the things he's trying to do, I think, are really novel. He's letting people vote online for the people he appoints to certain positions in the city government. But it seems that his communication style is not doing him much good. It's a bit rough, it's a bit abrupt. He's maybe used to ordering other doctors around. And you do need a totally different style in politics of communicating with their constituents. On the other hand, I know he's done some things already that very popular in Taiwan, simple things like, you know, changing the bus lanes in front of Taipei Station. On the other hand, he's gotten into a bit of a squabble with the chairman of Honhai Corporation, and feels the previous administration spent too much money on the facilities for the upcoming 2017, what do they call that, the Universidad?
Yes.
2017 Universidad. So I know, I wish him well, but I don't know. It just seems like he's getting off to a little bit of a rough start. What's your take?
Well, he is very interested in very down-to-earth, pragmatic solutions. He doesn't want to be bothered by a lot of bureaucracy. In his previous position, he was head of the emergency unit at Daida Hospital. So he had a very efficient system there with his doctors, of course, to try to determine when the patient came in, you know, what is the problem and so on. So he really works very fast and efficiently. And in his first few weeks in office, he has also tried to do a bit of that. He sometimes went a little bit overboard, but people love him for it. You know, they really love the way he is breaking through very traditional barriers, through a lot of bureaucracy, and also how he is really challenging some of the rather corrupt ways that were totally acceptable in the past. And here he is cutting like a good doctor should, with a very sharp knife, all the sores away.
You know, one thing that impressed me about him was that he stopped collecting campaign donations fairly early in his campaign. And then the amount of campaign funds that he had left over, he gave to charity. Whereas in Taiwan, most politicians would keep those, and the law allows them to take that and to set up foundations, which I think it's fair to say are fairly self-promoting. So that was quite an interesting step on his part.
Also, the way he collected donations was very interesting. Those were all very small donations collected via the internet. And while traditionally in Taiwan, the politicians raise money through donations from big donors, to which they then become beholden. And he is totally avoiding that kind of donation. So he indeed collected small donations until the limit was reached. And then he basically said, I don't want any donations anymore. And that was totally new in Taiwan. Nobody had heard any politician say we don't want any more donations. But he had reached the limit, and he had more than enough for his Facebook page. So that was great, and that really gave him a lot of goodwill in society.
He's a very interesting character, and I'm sure that we'll follow his administration very, very closely. You know, and I was just reading this morning, in this morning's Taipei Times, actually, that the winner of the mayoral race in Taichung did something also very interesting. Is his predecessor, Jason Hu, had invested a lot of time and energy into the development of what's called Taiwan's version of the Eiffel Tower, in this case, Taiwan Tower, which is a huge structure right in the middle of Taichung. And then the person who won in Taichung is really criticizing that as excessive spending. And it seems in this respect that both he, Mr. Lin, and Mr. Ke are on the same page. They're challenging a lot of these expenditures that were made by the previous administrations. I'm interested to see how this is going to eventuate.
Yeah, that was Mr. Lin Chia-long.
Right, Lin Chia-long, right.
Person who won in Taichung, and actually he won against Mr. Jason Hu, who had been mayor of Taichung for 13 years, and who was a very well-established Kuomintang figure. But Lin Chia-long was able, again, with a refreshing campaign, able to unseat him. And basically what both Mr. Ke and Mr. Lin Chia-long are doing is to have more transparency in this system of granting huge contracts to developers for huge buildings. And that type of contract has always been very much of a system for patronage. The developers made a lot of money with their projects, and the politicians were able to facilitate those projects and then in turn received a relatively large amount of money from these developers. So this has been very much of a tradition in Taiwan, and both these gentlemen are now trying to go to a system where there is more transparency, more openness in the bidding for those type of projects.
We're coming down to about our last 4 or 5 minutes, and I've got two other things I really want to get your view on. One is that Eric Chu Li Lun, has just been elected as the chairperson of the Nationalist Party. What's your take on him?
Well, he was, of course, the winner in Xinbei City, or as it used to be called, Taipei County, the area around Taipei. He was a very safe candidate, they thought, because he had been quite popular. He actually had a pretty moderate image, but he only very narrowly won over the DPP challenger. So if he had won very wide, with a wide margin, then he would have been a obvious candidate for the presidency 1 year from now. But the fact that he won only by a narrow margin really puts a dent in his candidacy for the presidency. Now he has run and he has become the chairman of the Kuomintang. And that will be very interesting to see if he indeed will, let's see, continue the policies of the Kuomintang in the old-fashioned way, or if he can really bring about some legislative reform, judicial reform, and, as I indicated earlier, reform in the ways of granting these big contracts to developers. If he is able to show some more transparency, then he might do pretty well. Another issue that is really, that he has to deal with is the so-called Kuomintang party assets. Over the years, the Kuomintang has remained the richest party in the world because it was able to grab the assets mainly of the Japanese government after it came to Taiwan in the period after World War II. And these assets really have enabled the Kuomintang to stay in power because they were able to finance the election campaign for so many of their candidates. Well, the DPP really didn't have that much money. So the big question that hangs over his head is now, will he be able to deal in a fair and transparent fashion with these Kuomintang party assets? He has said that he wants to deal with the issue, but he has not indicated in any fashion in what way he will do that.
One last question, and I'm sorry, but we only have 1 minute for this, is what about the recent flag-raising incident at Twin Oaks? Will Mr. Shun stay in Washington as ambassador, or will he be recalled? What's your guess? I'm sorry to only have less than a minute to put that question to you, but...
To be honest, I really don't know. Somebody got their wires crossed, whether it was Mr. Shen Lo-shun himself feeling that he had to go ahead while he really didn't from the State Department, or whether he had received indications that it might be okay, but this had not been cleared with the higher levels in the U.S. government. I presume he would stay for the time being, but I'm not sure for how long.
Well, thank you very much, Gerrit, for your insight and for joining us today from Washington, D.C. On a holiday. And thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back here next week at the same time. Our guest will be Dr. Stephen Young. Dr. Young is a former ambassador, de facto ambassador to Taiwan, and also was the Consul General in Hong Kong. And so it should be a great show, and we hope to see you then. Thank you for joining us.